The sand around the gun position was darker than the rest of the desert, stained by something that hadn't been there when the previous crew set up 3 days ago. Private Jack Hennessy noticed it the moment he dropped his pack beside the sandbag wall, but his new loader, a wiry man called Macklin who'd been at Bardia, just spat tobacco juice and said nothing about the colour of the ground. Subscribe to the channel and support the video with a like or comment. The Vickers machine gun sat on its tripod like a mechanical insect, water jacket gleaming dull in the late afternoon glare that turned the Libyan hills into wavering mirages. Jack had trained on these guns back in Sydney, knew every part by touch and designation, could strip and reassemble one blindfolded if pressed. But training hadn't prepared him for how personal it felt to crouch behind 40 pounds of steel and canvas belts, knowing that men on the other side of those rocky outcrops were doing calculations about where he sat. Macklin settled in beside him, running a rag along the ammunition feed with the casual attention of someone cleaning their teeth. He was maybe 30, which made him ancient by the standards of their company, and his hands moved with the kind of economy that came from having done the same task 500 times before. The battalion had pushed up to this position 2 nights earlier, part of the endless advance and retreat that characterized the Western Desert Campaign. Australian and German forces traded the same worthless stretches of rock and sand like boys swapping marbles, except the currency here was blood, and the price kept rising. Their machine gun section held the right flank of the company's defensive arc, overlooking a wadi that wound between hills the color of old bones. Jack could see 2 other gun positions from where he crouched, both dug in with the same careful attention to fields of fire and overhead cover. Macklin followed his gaze and grunted. "Don't get comfortable," he said, and it wasn't advice so much as prophecy. Jack watched him count out ammunition belts, lips moving silently, then arrange them in specific order beside the gun. 50 rounds per belt, 5 belts laid out within easy reach. Standard procedure, nothing unusual. But then Macklin stood and walked 15 paces to their left, dropped to his knees, and began clearing rocks from a patch of ground that looked identical to every other patch of ground in this whole godforsaken landscape. He came back, walked 15 paces right, repeated the process. Then straight back, same thing. When he returned to the gun position, his knees were dusty, and he was breathing harder than the effort warranted. Jack must have been staring, because Macklin looked at him with eyes that had gone flat. "Quote 1, he said. Quote 2. The sun was setting now, painting the wadi in shades of amber and shadow. Jack had been told to rest before stand 2, but his mind wouldn't settle. He kept looking at that dark patch of sand, kept wondering what had stained it. Finally, he asked. Macklin was brewing tea on a Tommy cooker, and he didn't look up when he answered. He poured water into 2 tin cups, handed one to Jack. Jack sipped the tea. It tasted like boiled dirt and metal. Macklin finally looked at him, and there was something in his expression that made Jack's stomach tighten. They fired about 90 rounds, maybe 100. Kept the gun in the same spot the whole engagement. Muzzle flash lit up that position like a bloody lighthouse. He drank his own tea in one long swallow. German observer was watching from those hills. Called in artillery. First round landed short. Second one landed long. Third one. He gestured at the dark sand. Third one landed exactly where it needed to. The temperature was dropping fast, the way it always did in the desert, and Jack pulled his jacket tighter. He understood now why Macklin had prepared those alternate positions. Understood the mathematics of survival that governed every burst of fire. The Vickers could fire 500 rounds per minute if you really opened her up, but speed wasn't the problem. Accuracy from the enemy was the problem. Predictability. Staying in one place long enough for some German forward observer to do simple geometry with your life. Macklin was loading magazines now, his movements methodical. Quote 9, he said, not looking up. Quote 10. Jack wanted to ask what happened if they couldn't move, if they were pinned down, or the tactical situation demanded sustained fire from one spot, but he already knew the answer. He'd seen it in the dark sand, in the crater that sat 3 feet from their current position like an open grave waiting for the next crew that forgot to count. Macklin seemed to read his thoughts. Quote 11, he said quietly. Quote 12. He looked up at the hills where the last light was fading. Quote 13. The intelligence tent sat 50 yards behind the forward positions, canvas stretched over a framework of scavenged timber and hope. Lieutenant Owen Cartwright hunched over a folding table that served as his entire operational headquarters, studying a map so creased and annotated it barely resembled the clean document he'd received from Brigade 3 weeks earlier. Red pins marked every confirmed enemy artillery strike against Australian positions in the past 10 days. Blue pins showed where their own machine gun teams had been positioned. The pattern shouldn't have been there, but it was, obvious as blood on sand once you knew to look for it. Cartwright had been a mathematics teacher in Melbourne before the war, spent his days explaining probability to bored teenagers who couldn't imagine why they'd ever need to calculate odds. Now he calculated odds every night, except the stakes were men's lives, and the exam never ended. He'd started noticing the correlation 4 days ago when a runner brought word that another Vickers crew had been hit, third one that week. Command called it bad luck, said the Germans were just ranging their artillery better. But Cartwright had pulled the action reports, cross-referenced them with strike locations, and found something that made his hands shake when he held the pencil. Every crew that had been hit fired more than 70 rounds from a single position. Every single one. The crews that survived had either fired fewer rounds or, and this was the interesting part, had moved their guns between firing sequences. He'd interviewed Macklin yesterday, one of the few loaders who'd been with the battalion since Bardia. The man had explained the 50-round rule like he was describing how to boil water, something so obvious it barely warranted discussion. But when Cartwright checked with other units, he found that most crews didn't follow any such protocol. British gun teams he'd spoken with thought the whole idea was colonial superstition, the kind of Bush League thinking that marked untrained colonials. A corporal named Davies stuck his head through the tent flap, bringing with him the smell of cordite and unwashed bodies. Quote 14. He handed over a canvas document case, salvaged from a destroyed enemy command post. Inside were reconnaissance logs, artillery plotting sheets, and, most valuable, the observation notes from a forward artillery spotter. Cartwright spread them across his map, wishing his German was better than the rudimentary vocabulary he'd picked up from a Jewish professor who'd fled Berlin in '38. The German spotter had been methodical, professional. Each entry noted the time, location, and duration of observed muzzle flashes. What caught Cartwright's attention was the annotations. Next to several entries, the German had written estimated round counts, 20 Schuss, 50 Schuss, 100 Schuss, and then, in some cases, coordinates. The coordinates matched the red pins on Cartwright's map with nauseating precision. The German had been counting rounds, timing the flashes, using the sustained fire positions to triangulate exact locations. Machine gun fire created a visible signature at night, each muzzle flash a beacon. A single burst might come from anywhere within a general area, but sustained fire from one point created a pattern, a fixed reference that transformed guesswork into mathematics. Cartwright lit a cigarette with fingers that had developed a tremor he couldn't quite control anymore. The German spotter had noted something else, scrawled in the margin of one page. Australia bewegen Waffen häufig. The Australians move weapons frequently. It was marked with a question mark and what might have been frustration. The German had been trying to solve a problem, trying to understand why some targets stayed still long enough to hit, while others seemed to vanish after every engagement. He hadn't cracked it, or if he had, the solution had died with him when a mortar round turned his observation post into a crater. But other German observers were still out there in the hills, still watching, still counting. Cartwright pulled a fresh sheet of paper and began drafting a tactical bulletin. He needed to convince battalion command that this wasn't superstition or cowardice or some quirk of Australian temperament. This was survival mathematics, as real and measurable as the ballistic tables they used to calculate artillery range. A machine gun firing from a fixed position for more than a minute created a target. The longer it fired, the more precise the enemy's calculations became. First ranging shot would land close. Second, closer. Third would obliterate everything within the kill radius. Davies was still standing there, waiting. Quote 15. Cartwright asked. The man shifted his weight, uncomfortable. Quote 16. Cartwright felt something cold settle in his chest. Quote 17. Davies nodded slowly. Quote 18. The coordinates Davies provided put the strike just north of their current position, in the rocky ground overlooking the coastal road. Cartwright added another red pin to his map. It clustered with the others in a constellation of failed probability, each point representing men who'd done their jobs perfectly and died for it. He thought about Macklin's dark certainty, about the 50-round rule that sounded like folklore but was actually applied game theory. The veterans had learned through pattern recognition what Cartwright was only now proving with data, that survival in modern warfare wasn't about bravery or marksmanship, but about denying the enemy the one thing he needed most: time. Time to observe, time to calculate, time to kill. He finished his cigarette and stubbed it out against the table leg. The tactical bulletin could wait until morning. Right now, he needed to walk the line. Needed to make sure every machine gun crew understood that the weapon that made them powerful also made them visible. And visibility in this war was just another word for dead. The Kokoda track was nothing like the desert. Where Libya had been open and honest in its hostility, New Guinea concealed its dangers under layers of green so thick that sunlight reached the jungle floor in scattered coins of pale gold. Sergeant Tom Brennan crouched beside his Vickers in a hastily scraped position that smelled of rotting vegetation and the particular funk of men who hadn't been dry in 3 weeks. His loader, a kid from Brisbane named Pierce, fed the ammunition belt with hands that shook slightly, though whether from malaria or fear, Brennan couldn't tell anymore. Everyone shook on the track. It was the default state of existence. They'd been hearing the Japanese for the past hour, movement in the thick scrub downslope from their position. Not the careful silence of a patrol, but the confident noise of men who thought they owned the night. Intelligence said a full company was pushing up the track, trying to flank the Australian positions at Isarava. Brennan's machine gun section was supposed to slow them down, buy time for the rest of the battalion to dig in properly. Simple mission. Probably fatal, but simple. He checked his watch in the failing light. 20 minutes until full dark. The Japanese preferred night attacks, came at you screaming and blowing bugles, counting on shock and confusion to break defensive lines. Pierce tapped his shoulder and pointed. Movement in the kunai grass, maybe 80 yards out. Shapes that resolved into men as Brennan's eyes adjusted. They were advancing in a loose skirmish line, rifles at the ready, moving with the assurance of troops who'd pushed Australian forces back for 2 weeks straight. Brennan let them come closer, waiting until he could make out individual faces in the dimness. The Vickers was sighted perfectly, water jacket topped off, belt of 250 rounds ready to feed. He'd set up 2 alternate positions earlier, both within quick crawling distance, both offering decent fields of fire. But looking at the advancing Japanese, he wondered if he'd have time to use them. At 40 yards, he opened fire. The Vickers hammered out its familiar rhythm, 500 rounds per minute of coordinated violence that turned the jungle into a slaughterhouse. Men dropped in the kunai grass, some dead before they hit the ground, others screaming in ways that cut through the gun's mechanical roar. The Japanese line wavered, broke, scattered for cover. Brennan fired in short bursts, sweeping the killing zone, while Pierce fed the belt and counted under his breath. 15 rounds. 20. 30. The barrel was heating up, water in the jacket starting to simmer. 40 rounds. Pierce's hand came down on Brennan's shoulder, urgent pressure. They were already moving when the first mortar round landed. It hit 20 feet from where the Vickers had been, shrapnel singing through the space they'd occupied 3 seconds earlier. Brennan dragged the gun to the left-hand alternate position, while Pierce grabbed ammunition boxes and the spare water can. The gun weighed 60 pounds without tripod or ammunition, and moving it through jungle undergrowth in near darkness while mortar rounds walked toward you was the kind of experience that aged men in ways calendars couldn't measure. They set up in the new position, Brennan's lungs burning, and he immediately opened fire again on the Japanese troops who were rallying below. Another 30 rounds, sweeping fire that caught a group trying to work around their flank. The muzzle flash in the darkness was like lightning. each burst illuminating the jungle in stark snapshots of violence. Pierce counted, his lips moving in silent prayer or calculation, or both. 28, 29, 30. He tapped Brennan's shoulder again, but this time there was hesitation. The Japanese were rushing their position now, had figured out where the fire was coming from. If they moved the gun again, they'd lose the advantageous height, might not be able to stop the advance. If they stayed, the mortars would find them. Brennan could hear the tubes firing from somewhere in the valley below. That distinctive thump that meant high explosive was arcing through the night sky toward exact coordinates. Brennan made the choice and hated himself for it. They scrambled to the third position, dragging the gun through mud and roots while Japanese bullets cracked overhead. A mortar round hit the second position before they were fully clear, the blast wave shoving Brennan face first into the jungle floor. His ears rang with a high keen that wouldn't stop. Pierce was yelling something, but the words were just shapes without meaning. They set up again, Brennan's hands moving on automatic, muscle memory taking over, while his conscious mind tried to catch up with what had just happened. The Vickers settled onto its tripod, Pierce slapped a fresh belt into the feed, and Brennan fired into the darkness where muzzle flashes showed him Japanese positions. The rhythm changed then. The Japanese weren't advancing anymore, were taking cover, returning fire from static positions. Brennan fired 20 rounds at one position, shifted aim, fired 15 at another. Never more than 30 from one spot. They moved the gun 4 more times in the next hour, each displacement a frantic scramble through hostile jungle, while mortars searched for them and rifle fire tried to pin them in place. By the time the Japanese finally pulled back, Brennan had lost count of how many times they'd moved, how many rounds they'd fired, how many men he'd killed or wounded in the strobing muzzle flash darkness. Dawn came slowly, filtering through the canopy in shades of gray, before finally admitting color. Brennan sat beside the Vickers and counted the alternate positions they'd used. 7. 7 different spots in a 100-yard stretch of jungle. Around each abandoned position were craters from mortar rounds, some still smoking in the morning humidity. Pierce was checking the gun, refilling the water jacket from a stream that ran red with something Brennan chose not to examine closely. The kid looked at him with eyes 10 years older than they'd been yesterday. "We fired 470 rounds," Pierce said quietly. "Never more than 50 from one spot. Moved every time, just like training said." Brennan nodded, too exhausted to speak. Around them, the jungle was already reclaiming the battlefield. Vines and insects moving in to cover the evidence of what men did to each other when nations disagreed. But there was something else. Something that made Brennan's exhausted brain struggle to focus. He walked back to their first firing position, looked at the crater from that initial mortar round, then to the second position, third. Each crater was within 15 feet of where they'd set up the gun. The Japanese weren't just ranging on muzzle flash anymore. They were predicting where the gun would move next, calculating likely alternate positions, pre-ranging their mortars to cover probable displacement routes. The tactic that had kept them alive in Libya was being countered, adapted to, turned into another variable in the enemy's mathematics of death. Captain Gerald Whitmore watched the Australians reposition their machine gun for the third time in 20 minutes, and felt the familiar irritation that colonials always inspired in him. He'd been attached to the Australian battalion as a liaison officer from the British 8th Army, a posting he'd initially welcomed as a chance to observe Commonwealth forces in action. What he'd observed instead was a collection of unmilitary habits dressed up as tactical doctrine. The Australians didn't salute properly, called their officers by first names, and apparently believed that machine guns were meant to be dragged across the desert like nomadic tents, rather than properly emplaced in defensive positions. His own Vickers crew sat 40 yards to the left of the Australian position, dug in with textbook precision. Sandbags stacked in regulation pattern, overhead cover against airburst shells, ammunition stored in proper order. Corporal Matthews and Private Shaw had the guns sighted to cover the approach from the Wadi, interlocking fields of fire with the Australian position. They'd been there since yesterday afternoon, and would remain there until ordered to displace. That was how defensive positions worked. You found good ground, you fortified it, you held it. You didn't scurry about like frightened rabbits every time you fired a burst. Whitmore had tried explaining this to the Australian sergeant, a rangy man named Brennan, who'd somehow survived both Libya and New Guinea, despite tactical habits that would have earned a court-martial in a proper army. Brennan had listened with that peculiar colonial patience that felt more like condescension, then thanked Whitmore for his input and gone right back to moving his gun every 50 rounds. When Whitmore pressed the issue, suggested that perhaps British experience in modern warfare might be worth considering, Brennan had simply asked how many Vickers crews Whitmore had personally commanded in combat. The answer was none. Whitmore was an infantry officer, assigned to machine gun liaison only because he'd taken a gunnery course at Sandhurst. The conversation had ended there. Now, as dusk painted the Libyan hills in shades of copper and shadow, Whitmore stood behind his own gun crew and felt vindicated in his certainty. Matthews had the Vickers locked down, traverse and elevation set for maximum coverage of the likely German approach. 250 rounds belted and ready, spare ammunition within easy reach. This was proper military procedure, the kind of disciplined preparation that had built an empire. When the Germans came, and intelligence said they would come tonight, Matthews would demonstrate what sustained, accurate fire from a fixed position could accomplish. The attack began just after full dark, exactly as predicted. German infantry advancing in sections, using the wadi for cover, probing for weak points in the Australian line. Whitmore heard the Australian Vickers open up first, that distinctive hammering that turned night into stuttering daylight with each muzzle flash. Matthews waited, professional and calm, until the German troops reached his designated killing zone. Then he opened fire, and the Vickers sang its mechanical song of empire and industrial death. Men fell in the wadi. Others scattered for cover. The German advance stalled, pinned by interlocking fire from both machine guns. Matthews fired in controlled bursts, exactly as trained. 10 rounds. Pause. Assess. Adjust aim. Another burst. The barrel glowed faintly in the darkness, water jackets steaming. Whitmore counted ammunition expenditure automatically. 40 rounds. 60. 80. The Germans were taking casualties, falling back, regrouping. This was working. This was proof that British tactical doctrine, refined through centuries of warfare, was superior to colonial improvisation. He glanced toward the Australian position and saw they were moving their gun again, abandoning perfectly good firing positions for no reason Whitmore could fathom. Cowardice dressed up as tactics, he thought, running away and calling it maneuver. Matthews fired another burst, bringing their total to approximately 120 rounds. The Germans had pulled back into the wadi, were returning fire but without coordination. The engagement was winding down. In another few minutes they'd break contact entirely, would have to report to their command that Australian and British machine guns had stopped their probe cold. Whitmore felt the satisfaction of vindication warming him more thoroughly than the night's chill warranted. He'd write this up in his liaison report, document the difference between disciplined British fire and Australian flailing about. The first ranging shot landed 30 yards short, throwing up a gout of sand and rock. Whitmore's satisfaction curdled into confusion. The Germans were shelling their own withdrawal route? Matthews kept firing, perhaps hadn't even noticed the impact. Another burst, another 10 rounds. They'd expended close to 150 rounds now from this position. Whitmore's mental arithmetic was interrupted by the second shell, which landed 20 yards over their position. His stomach dropped. Not German artillery. British artillery could be wild, especially at night. But this wasn't wild. This was systematic. This was ranging fire. The third shell landed 10 yards short. Whitmore's body understood, before his mind caught up, was already diving for the communication trench when Matthews looked up from the gun with a question forming on his lips. The fourth shell hit exactly where it needed to. The explosion erased the gun position, erased Matthews and Shore, erased Whitmore's certainty about everything he'd thought he understood about modern warfare. He found himself lying in the trench, with dirt raining down on his helmet and a ringing in his ears that felt like it would never stop. Someone was pulling him up, dragging him down the trench, away from the smoking crater. Australian voices, rough hands checking him for wounds. His uniform was shredded, but he was intact. Physically, at least. They pulled him into the Australian position, where Brennan was setting up his Vickers for another firing sequence. The sergeant looked at Whitmore with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite anger. Quote 21, Brennan said flatly. Quote 22. Whitmore wanted to argue, wanted to explain proper defensive doctrine, wanted to say something about how this was just bad luck, how artillery was always a gamble. But he'd seen the pattern of the ranging fire, had felt the methodical progression of shells walking toward their target with mathematical precision. Someone on the German side had been watching, counting, calculating, and Matthews had given them all the time they needed. Brennan was moving his gun again, Pierce counting rounds under his breath. 47, 48. They'd fire 3 more rounds and then displace to another position. Whitmore couldn't even see in the darkness. He sat in the trench and looked at the crater where his gun crew had been moments before. There was nothing left, no bodies to recover, no equipment to salvage, just a smoking hole and the smell of cordite and cooked earth. The Australian Vickers opened up again from a new position, fired exactly 49 rounds, and then went silent as the crew scrambled to move it again. In the darkness, Whitmore could hear German artillery firing, could imagine the observers with their binoculars and timing devices, trying to track movement that refused to stay still long enough to kill. He thought about Sandhurst and tactical doctrine and the proper way to employ defensive weaponry. Then he thought about Matthews and Shore, who'd followed every rule correctly and died for it. Oberleutnant Klaus Fischer sat in his observation post carved into the hillside above Tobruk and watched the Australian defensive line through Zeiss binoculars that had cost more than 3 months of his salary. The binoculars were worth it. In the 2 weeks he'd been stationed here, they'd helped him call in artillery strikes that destroyed 4 machine gun positions, 2 mortar teams, and what he suspected was a forward command post. The Australians defending the fortress were stubborn and resourceful, but they were also predictable in ways that made his job almost too easy. Almost. Because lately something had changed, and Fischer couldn't quite identify what. He'd been an artillery observer since Poland, had refined his craft through France and now North Africa. The job required patience, mathematics, and a certain detachment from the fact that your calculations resulted in men being torn apart by high explosive. Fischer had made peace with that detachment years ago. War was geometry applied to flesh, and he was good at geometry. His notebook contained detailed observations on Australian defensive positions, firing patterns, rotation schedules. He knew which sectors were held by experienced troops and which by fresh replacements. He knew when they ate, when they slept, when they were most vulnerable. Machine guns were his preferred targets. They were powerful, visible, and critically important to defensive integrity. Destroy a machine gun position, and you created a gap that infantry could exploit. The method was simple. Observe the muzzle flash, count the duration of fire, triangulate the position using known reference points, call in coordinates to the artillery battery. First shell would land close. Adjust based on impact. Second shell, closer. Third shell should obliterate the target. Fischer had performed this sequence so many times it had become routine. A job like any other job. Except the office was a hole in the ground, and the paperwork was written in coordinates and angles of fire. Tonight, he'd been watching a particular section of the Australian line, where intelligence suggested a machine gun position was located. The Australians had fired twice in the past hour, brief bursts at what might have been a patrol or might have been shadows. Fischer had marked the approximate location, but couldn't get a precise fix because the firing had been too short. Then, just after 2200 hours, the gun opened up again. He could see the muzzle flash clearly, a strobing light that painted the night in stark intervals. Fischer started his stopwatch and began counting flashes. 10, 15, 20. He was already reaching for his radio when the gun went silent and the muzzle flash disappeared. Fischer waited. Sometimes crews paused to change ammunition belts or clear jams. But 30 seconds passed, then a minute, and the gun didn't resume fire from that position. Instead, muzzle flash erupted from a different location, perhaps 15 meters to the left of the original position. Fischer swore quietly in educated Bavarian German that would have scandalized his mother. They'd moved the gun. He started counting again, trying to get a duration fix on the new position. 23 flashes this time, before the gun went silent again. When it resumed fire, it was from yet another location, this one to the right of the original position. He'd seen this pattern before, had noted it in his observation log with a question mark and growing frustration. The Australians were rotating firing positions, never staying in one place long enough for accurate artillery ranging. Fischer had tried to establish a pattern to their movement, some regularity he could exploit. If he could predict where they'd move next, he could pre-range artillery on the anticipated position. But the Australians seemed to vary their displacement distance and direction randomly. Sometimes they moved 10 meters, sometimes 20, sometimes left, sometimes right, sometimes straight back. There was no pattern Fischer could discern. He considered the problem with the methodical attention he applied to all tactical challenges. The Australians were clearly counting rounds, which suggested they understood the observation to impact timeline. 50 rounds seemed to be their rough threshold, though Fischer had observed variations from 30 to 70 depending on circumstances. They understood that sustained fire created a target, so they refused to provide sustained fire from any single position. Simple, effective, infuriating. Fischer had recommended counter-battery fire, trying to suppress their positions with preemptive shelling. But ammunition was limited, and the Australians had proven adept at dispersing before barrages could achieve concentration. The Australian machine gun fired again, another short burst from a fourth position. Fischer marked it on his map, now decorated with small crosses showing observed firing points. There were 7 crosses in a 100-metre stretch of defensive line, showing the Australian crew's range of movement. If Fischer could get artillery to saturate the entire zone simultaneously, he might catch them, regardless of which position they occupied. But that would require at least a dozen shells, probably more, and his battery commander was already complaining about ammunition expenditure versus confirmed kills. Fischer watched through his binoculars as the Australian gun shifted positions again. He could see the movement now that he knew to look for it, could make out shadows displacing in the darkness. They were fast, practiced, had clearly done this hundreds of times. He thought about the crews he'd successfully targeted, remembered the satisfaction of watching a position he'd ranged get obliterated by accurate fire. Those had all been crews that held position too long, that fired sustained bursts from static emplacements. Those had been crews that either didn't know the counting game or didn't have the discipline to play it properly. But these Australians knew. They'd learned through casualties and near misses and whatever tactical education their commanders provided. They'd learned that survival in modern warfare wasn't about courage or firepower, but about denying the enemy the data he needed to kill you. And they'd learned it well enough that Fischer, with all his experience and training and expensive binoculars, couldn't reliably target them. He made another notation in his log, circled the cluster of firing positions, and added a new comment in the margin. Australia sehr diszipliniert bei Positionswechsel. Müssen neue Taktik entwickeln. The night wore on and the Australian gun continued its dance, appearing, firing, vanishing, reappearing elsewhere. Fischer kept watching, kept counting, kept calculating. Somewhere in the defensive line below, men were dragging a 60-pound machine gun through dirt and darkness every few minutes, exhausting themselves for the chance to see another dawn. And somewhere behind the German lines, artillery crews waited for coordinates that Fischer couldn't quite provide with the precision required for guaranteed kills. The war had become a mathematical contest, and the Australians had just demonstrated they could count as well as he could. Better, perhaps, because they'd turned counting into doctrine, while Fischer was still trying to find a way around it. Private Danny Walsh sat with his back against the sandbag wall and watched Corporal Mackenzie prepare the alternate firing positions with movements that had become ritual. 3 positions scraped into the rocky ground, each offering decent cover and overlapping fields of fire, each close enough to reach quickly, but far enough apart to force enemy observers to recalculate. Walsh had been on Mackenzie's gun crew for 6 weeks now, had learned the rhythm of displacement until his body performed it without conscious thought. 47 rounds, grab the tripod legs. 48, disconnect the ammunition belt. 49, lift together on Mackenzie's count. 50, move. Except Walsh was tired in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. They had been holding this sector of the Tobruk perimeter for 11 days, living in holes scraped from ground that seemed composed entirely of rock and flies. The water ration was a pint per day, which had to cover drinking, washing, and refilling the Vickers cooling jacket. Walsh's lips were cracked and bleeding, his tongue felt like leather, and his hands shook with a tremor that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the cumulative toll of moving a machine gun 40 times per night. He'd done the mathematics himself during one of the rare quiet periods. If they engaged enemy forces 6 times per night, moving the gun after every 50 rounds, that meant 240 trips carrying 60 pounds of steel across broken ground in darkness while people tried to kill you. Mackenzie finished the position prep and crawled back to where Walsh sat. The corporal was from Sydney, had worked at the shipyards before the war, and possessed the kind of calm competence that made men trust him even when circumstances suggested trust was a poor survival strategy. He pulled a cigarette from a tin that had once held boot polish and lit it with a match cupped carefully against the wind. The smell of tobacco mixed with cordite and the peculiar scent of the desert at night, which was something like hot stone cooling mixed with things better left unexamined. "Thinking about skipping one?" Mackenzie asked quietly. Walsh looked at him, startled that his thoughts were so transparent. "Just tired," he said, which was true but incomplete. Mackenzie drew on his cigarette, the ember glowing in the darkness. "Had a gunner in my last crew thought the same thing. Name was Collins, good bloke, worked at a bank in Melbourne. We were at Bardia, Germans probing our positions every night. Collins said we'd moved the gun 30 times in 3 days and he was done with it. Said we'd take our chances, hold one good position, and make the bastards pay for every yard." Walsh waited, knowing there was more, knowing from Mackenzie's tone that this story didn't end with Collins celebrating his decision back in Cairo. Mackenzie flicked ash from his cigarette and continued. "We held position through one engagement, then another. Must have fired 200 rounds from the same spot over maybe 10 minutes. Collins was right in one sense. We did make them pay. Cut down at least 20 Germans trying to rush our position. But what Collins didn't account for was that every one of those muzzle flashes was a data point for their observer. Every tracer round painted a line straight back to where we sat. The night was quiet except for the distant rumble of artillery. Someone else's war happening over the horizon. Mackenzie's voice was flat, reciting facts without emotion. First shell landed behind us, maybe 30 yards over. Collins laughed, said they couldn't range for shit. Second shell landed in front, 20 yards short. I knew what was happening. Started to grab the gun. Collins told me to wait. Said we'd earn this position with blood, and he wasn't giving it up over 1 or 2 shells. Mackenzie stubbed out his cigarette with careful attention. Third shell landed exactly on target. I was loading ammunition from the reserve position 10 yards back. Collins was still on the gun. Found pieces of him scattered across 15 yards of desert. Walsh felt his stomach tighten. He'd heard variations of this story before, knew that every veteran gunner in the battalion had a version they told to new crew members. But hearing it from Mackenzie, who never wasted words and never exaggerated, made it hit differently. Walsh asked. Mackenzie looked at him with eyes that reflected starlight. They sat in silence, each occupied with calculations that had nothing to do with artillery tables, and everything to do with the price of exhaustion measured against the cost of staying still. Walsh thought about Collins at his bank in Melbourne, counting money and living a life where the most dangerous thing he did was cross the street against traffic. That Collins had died in the desert trying to hold one position too many, and now here was Walsh contemplating the same mistake for the same reasons. The weight of the gun, the endless displacement, the grinding exhaustion that turned simple tasks into ordeals. Movement from the wadi below cut through Walsh's thoughts. Mackenzie had the binoculars up before Walsh could speak, was scanning the darkness for confirmation of what they'd both heard. Quote 31, Mackenzie murmured. Quote 32. He handed the binoculars to Walsh while he settled behind the Vickers, checking the belt feed, adjusting traverse. Walsh could see them now, German infantry moving in a loose formation, confident in the darkness. They'd reached the killing zone in less than a minute. Mackenzie opened fire at 50 yards, the Vickers hammering out its familiar rhythm. Men dropped, others scattered for cover. Tracer rounds drew lines across the night, each one a finger pointing back to their position. Walsh counted automatically, muscle memory taking over conscious thought. 20 rounds, 30, 40. His hand was already reaching for the tripod when Mackenzie fired the 49th round. They moved together, disconnecting, lifting, carrying the gun to the first alternate position 15 yards to their right. Set up, reload, fire again. The Germans were returning fire now, bullets cracking overhead, impacting the sandbags around their original position. Another 47 rounds from the new position, cutting down Germans who'd been maneuvering toward where the gun used to be. Displacement to the second alternate, 20 yards back and 10 to the left. Walsh's arms screamed with fatigue, but they moved anyway, because Mackenzie was moving, and because Collins had stopped moving, and staying still meant joining Collins in the category of cautionary tales told to exhausted privates. They set up, fired, displaced again. 3 times in 8 minutes, repositioning the gun while Germans tried to fix their location and artillery observers somewhere in the hills tried to calculate coordinates from muzzle flash and timing. The engagement ended when the German probe pulled back, leaving bodies in the wadi and the night to absorb the sound of their retreat. Mackenzie and Walsh sat in their third position, breathing hard, the Vickers steaming between them. Walsh's hands were bleeding from rope burns where he'd gripped the tripod. His shoulders felt dislocated, and his legs shook from carrying weight across broken ground while people shot at him. Mackenzie was reloading ammunition belts, getting ready for the next engagement that would come before dawn. "Still thinking about skipping one?" he asked without looking up. Walsh looked at their original firing position, saw the impacts where German fire had concentrated, saw the crater from a mortar round that had landed close enough to shower the position with rock fragments. He thought about Collins and his bank in Melbourne. "No," Walsh said quietly, "not thinking about that anymore." Mackenzie nodded and went back to his ammunition preparation. Somewhere in the darkness, German observers were writing in their notebooks, trying to find patterns in Australian displacement, trying to solve the problem of targets that refused to stay still. And somewhere in the defensive line, other gun crews were having the same conversation Walsh and Mackenzie just had, making the same calculations about exhaustion versus extinction, about the weight of steel versus the weight of staying alive. The tactical situation at El Alamein was different from anything Sergeant Tom Brennan had experienced in 2 years of desert warfare. Here the lines were fixed, positions fortified with months of preparation rather than hours. Minefields stretched for miles in organized patterns that forced any attack into predetermined channels. Artillery was pre-registered on every likely approach. This wasn't the fluid combat of advance and retreat that had characterized the earlier campaigns. This was industrial warfare, modern siege operations dressed up as mobile battle. And it meant that some of the old rules didn't apply anymore. Brennan's gun crew held a position overlooking one of the minefield gaps, a 50-yard channel that any German armor would have to traverse to reach the Australian defensive line. They'd been here for 3 days, long enough to become intimately familiar with every rock and depression in their sector. Behind them, infantry occupied slit trenches in depth. To their flanks, other machine guns created interlocking fields of fire. Above them, the sky belonged to artillery observers who could drop shells with precision that would have seemed miraculous a year ago. This was defense in depth, professionally organized, and it left very little room for the kind of improvisation that had kept Brennan alive through Libya and New Guinea. The problem was that their position was good. Too good. They had perfect sight lines on the minefield gap, excellent cover from a natural rock formation, and overhead protection against anything short of a direct hit. Moving from this position meant giving up significant tactical advantages. The alternate positions they'd prepared were adequate, but inferior, lacking the height and protection of the primary position. Brennan had explained this to Lieutenant Cartwright when the officer made his rounds 2 days ago. Cartwright had listened, nodded, and said something about calculated risks versus doctrinal purity. In the end, he'd left the decision to Brennan. If the tactical situation demanded sustained fire from one position, then Brennan could make that call. But he'd have to live with the consequences. Now, as German panzers appeared on the far side of the minefield, Brennan faced the decision he'd been dreading. The tanks were advancing in formation, infantry moving alongside in half-tracks, a combined arms assault that command had been predicting for weeks. Australian artillery opened up immediately, shells landing among the German vehicles with impressive accuracy. 2 panzers erupted in flames. A half-track threw a track and slewed sideways. But the attack kept coming, and the surviving vehicles were heading straight for the minefield gap that Brennan's gun covered. The 1st Panzer entered the gap doing maybe 15 miles per hour, turret traversing as it searched for targets. Brennan opened fire, not at the tank itself, but at the infantry following behind it. The Vickers couldn't penetrate tank armor, but it could shred the supporting troops that made armor effective. His first burst caught 3 men, tumbling them into the sand. The Panzer's machine gun returned fire, bullets sparking off the rocks around Brennan's position. Pierce was counting rounds, his voice steady despite the incoming fire. 20, 25, 30. More German infantry were in the gap now, dismounting from half-tracks, trying to suppress the Australian positions with rifle and machine gun fire. Brennan kept firing, sweeping the gap, preventing the infantry from organizing. 40 rounds. 45. The Panzer was through the gap now, was turning to engage the forward Australian positions with its main gun. Behind it, another tank was entering the gap, and behind that, a third. 50 rounds. Pierce's hand came down on Brennan's shoulder, but Brennan shook it off and kept firing. German infantry were trying to flank their position, were using a destroyed half-track for cover. If Brennan stopped firing now, if they displaced to an inferior position, those infantry would break through, and the entire defensive line would collapse. 60 rounds. 70. The Vickers was running hot, water in the jacket boiling, steam venting from the system. Pierce was no longer counting aloud, but his hand stayed on Brennan's shoulder, pressure increasing with each burst. Brennan knew what he was doing, knew he was violating every rule they'd lived by for 2 years. But the rules had been written for different circumstances, for mobile warfare where positions could be abandoned without catastrophic consequences. Here, abandoning this position meant watching German infantry pour through the gap and overrun the defensive line. 80 rounds. 90. An anti-tank gun to their left scored a hit on the lead Panzer, penetrating the side armor, cooking off ammunition in a spectacular explosion that lit the battlefield like noon. The concussion from the blast rattled Brennan's teeth. He shifted fire to the infantry sheltering behind the burning wreck, caught them as they tried to withdraw, cut them down as they ran. 100 rounds. Pierce was shouting now, actually shouting over the gun's thunder, but Brennan couldn't hear the words, could only feel the hand on his shoulder and the weight of the decision he'd made. German artillery started falling then, ranging fire that searched for the sources of defensive fire. The first shell landed 100 yards to their right, hitting an Australian mortar position and silencing it permanently. The second shell landed 50 yards to their left. Brennan understood what was happening, had seen this pattern enough times to recognize it even through the fog of combat. They were being ranged, methodically and professionally. The next shell would be closer. The one after that would obliterate their position. But if he stopped firing now, the German infantry in the gap would rally and push through. 120 rounds. The barrel was glowing, heat waves rising from the metal. Another shell landed, this one 30 yards behind them, showering their position with rock fragments. Pierce had stopped pulling on Brennan's shoulder, had accepted that they were staying here, regardless of consequences. He was feeding ammunition and praying, words in what might have been Italian or Latin, some language from his grandmother or childhood that resurfaced when conscious thought surrendered to instinct and fear. 150 rounds. The 3rd Panzer was through the gap now, but the infantry support was shredded, bodies littering the minefield in patterns that would have been beautiful if they hadn't been men. Australian anti-tank guns were engaging the armour, while Brennan's Vickers kept the supporting troops suppressed. The defensive line was holding. They were winning this engagement. But the German artillery had their range now. Brennan could feel it in the progression of impacts, could calculate the trajectory that would intersect with his position in the next 30 seconds. 175 rounds. Pierce's prayers had turned into a single repeated phrase. No longer words, but just sound, rhythm to match the Vickers' mechanical heartbeat. Brennan fired into the gap, into the smoke and fire and chaos of combined arms warfare, meeting prepared defensive positions. Another German shell landed 15 yards to their front, the blast wave hitting like a physical punch. Brennan's ears were ringing, blood running from his nose, but his hands kept working the gun, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant the gap would open and men he'd served with for 2 years would get overrun. 200 rounds. The tactical situation was changing, German attack faltering, panzers burning in the minefield. But somewhere in the hills behind the German lines, an artillery observer was calling in final coordinates, was making the last adjustments that would drop high explosive exactly on target. Brennan fired his 200th and first round, broke every rule he'd ever learned, and waited for the mathematics of observation and impact to complete their inevitable equation. The shell was already in the air, already arcing down toward them, and there was nothing left to do but keep firing until it arrived. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto crouched in the observation post carved into the ridge above the Kokoda track and studied the Australian positions through captured British binoculars. He'd been an artillery officer for 3 years, had learned his craft in China, where targets were plentiful and ammunition expenditure was a matter of imperial pride rather than logistical constraint. New Guinea was different. Here, every shell had to be carried up impossible trails by men who could barely manage their own equipment. Here, artillery was a precision instrument rather than a bludgeon, and observers who wasted ammunition on uncertain targets found themselves reassigned to infantry duties. The Australians defending this sector had proven frustratingly difficult to target. Yamamoto had observed their machine gun positions for 5 nights now, had documented their firing patterns with the methodical attention that had earned him top marks at artillery school. What he'd discovered was that the Australians moved their weapons constantly, never firing more than 50 rounds from any single position before displacing to prepared alternate locations. This wasn't luck or coincidence. This was doctrine, systematically applied, and it had resulted in a strike rate that embarrassed Yamamoto every time he reported to his battery commander. But Yamamoto had noticed something else, a pattern within the pattern that might offer opportunity. The Australians varied their displacement distances, but their alternate positions clustered within predictable zones. A machine gun firing from position A would displace to either position B or position C, both within 20 meters of the original location. This made tactical sense. Moving too far meant losing sight lines and fields of fire. But it also meant that if Yamamoto could map the probable alternate positions, he could pre-range artillery to cover multiple locations simultaneously. He'd spent the past 2 days doing exactly that, plotting observed firing positions on a detailed map he'd drawn himself. The Australian machine gun section that held the ridge across from his observation post operated from 7 distinct positions, all within a 100-meter stretch of defensive line. Yamamoto had marked each position, calculated coordinates, and developed a fire plan that would saturate the entire zone with a rolling barrage. It would require 18 shells, a significant expenditure, but if successful, it would eliminate a key defensive position and create a gap for Japanese infantry to exploit. The attack was scheduled for tonight, and Yamamoto had positioned himself to observe the results personally. His fire plan was elegant, economical in its brutality. The barrage would begin at the southern end of the Australian defensive zone and walk northward in 3-meter intervals, covering every position the machine gun might occupy. The Australians could move as much as they wanted, could follow their displacement doctrine perfectly, and still find themselves within the kill radius of at least 3 shells. Yamamoto had run the calculations multiple times, had checked his mathematics until he could recite the coordinates from memory. The Japanese attack began just after midnight. infantry advancing up the muddy track in sections, using the jungle for cover. The Australian machine gun opened fire almost immediately, muzzle flash painting the darkness in strobing intervals. Yamamoto started his stopwatch and began counting. 20 rounds. 25. 30. The gun went silent, and Yamamoto marked the position on his map. 15 seconds later, muzzle flash erupted from a different location, exactly as predicted. Position B on his chart, 12 meters southeast of position A. The Australians were following their pattern perfectly. Yamamoto reached for his radio and began calling in coordinates to the battery positioned 3 kilometers behind the Japanese lines. He started with position A, even though the Australians had already displaced from it. The first shell landed exactly on target, obliterating the abandoned position. 3 seconds later, the second shell landed on position B, where the Australian gun had just been firing. But the Australians had displaced again, were now firing from position D, 20 meters north. Yamamoto adjusted his call, bringing the barrage northward according to his pre-planned sequence. Shell 3 landed on position C, Shell 4 on position D. The Australians kept moving, kept firing from different positions, but now they were moving within a zone that Yamamoto was systematically destroying. Shell 5, Shell 6, each one precisely placed according to coordinates Yamamoto had calculated days earlier. He could hear the explosions echoing across the valley, could see the flash of impacts illuminating the jungle in brief snapshots of violence. The Australian machine gun was still firing, but the bursts were shorter now, more desperate. Then something unexpected happened. The Australian gun went silent completely. No muzzle flash, no firing, just darkness and the sound of shells continuing to impact across their defensive zone. Yamamoto kept the barrage going according to plan, Shell 7, 8, 9, walking the explosions across every position he'd mapped. But there was no return fire, no indication that the Australians were still in the zone at all. Shell 10 landed where position E should have been, Shell 11 on position F. Still nothing from the Australian gun. Yamamoto called a halt to the barrage after the 13th shell, conserving ammunition for other targets. He scanned the Australian defensive line through his binoculars, searching for movement, for some indication of what had happened. The Japanese infantry attack was pushing forward, taking advantage of the suppressed Australian position. They were almost to the ridge when the Australian machine gun opened fire again, but from a position Yamamoto hadn't mapped, hadn't even considered. It was 40 meters south of the zone he'd been saturating, back near where the Australians had started their defensive line weeks ago. The realization hit Yamamoto like physical impact. The Australians hadn't been caught in his barrage. They'd recognized what was happening, recognized the systematic destruction of their prepared positions, and had displaced outside the pattern entirely. They'd moved to an old position, one they'd abandoned days ago as untenable, and were now firing from ground Yamamoto had dismissed as tactically irrelevant. The Japanese infantry, caught in the open by fire from an unexpected direction, took heavy casualties and fell back in disorder. Yamamoto sat in his observation post and looked at his map, at the careful plotting he'd done, at the coordinates he'd calculated with such precision. Every shell had landed exactly where he'd intended. Every calculation had been correct. But the Australians had changed the equation by refusing to play the game he'd designed for them. They'd varied their pattern, broken their own doctrine, adapted to his adaptation. The 50-round rule wasn't just about counting anymore. It was about unpredictability, about denying the enemy not just targeting data, but behavioural patterns. He made a notation in his log, writing in the careful characters his artillery instructor had drilled into him at school. The note said that Australian machine gun crews had begun varying displacement patterns, moving outside established zones, using abandoned positions to create tactical surprise. They were learning faster than he could develop countermeasures. Yamamoto thought about the 18 shells he'd expended, about the battery commander's face when he reported 0 confirmed kills, about the Japanese infantry who died because the Australians had moved somewhere his mathematics didn't account for. The Australian gun fired again, another burst from the unexpected position. Yamamoto could see the muzzle flash clearly, could calculate coordinates, could call in artillery that might or might not find a target that would or would not still be there by the time the shells arrived. The war had become a game of infinite variation, and the side that could adapt fastest would survive, while the other side turned mathematics into epitaphs. Yamamoto reached for his radio, knowing he had to try, knowing that trying might not be enough anymore. Borneo, in the summer of 1945, felt like the war's forgotten epilogue, combat operations continuing in thick jungle while everyone's attention focused on the impending invasion of Japan itself. Sergeant Tom Brennan sat behind his Vickers in a position overlooking a trail the Japanese used for supply movement, and reflected that he'd been doing this for so long he could barely remember what came before. 3 years of moving machine guns across deserts and jungles. 3 years of counting to 50 and scrambling to new positions while people tried to calculate where he'd be when their shells arrived. He'd survived El Alamein despite firing 200 rounds from one position. Survived because Australian anti-tank guns had knocked out the German observation post 30 seconds before the final ranging shell would have landed. Luck, not skill. He understood the difference now. Pierce sat beside him, older and quieter than the kid who'd prayed in Italian during that desperate stand at Alamein. They'd been together through the entire Pacific campaign, had developed a rhythm that required almost no verbal communication. A glance, a gesture, and they were moving the gun to the next position. They'd prepared 9 alternate positions for this operation, more than usual because intelligence suggested this would be one of the final actions before the war ended. Everyone knew Japan was finished. Everyone knew it was just a matter of time before surrender or invasion resolved the question. But until that happened, men still died in obscure corners of occupied territory, and machine guns still needed to be moved every 50 rounds. The Australian intelligence corporal who'd briefed them yesterday had emphasized that Japanese artillery in this sector was limited, but their mortar teams were active and well trained. They'd also apparently been reading the same tactical manuals as everyone else, because they'd started adapting to Australian displacement patterns. The corporal had shown them captured Japanese documents, observation logs that plotted Australian machine gun positions with disturbing accuracy. The Japanese were mapping probable alternate positions, varying their response times, trying to predict displacement patterns. The 50-round rule was still valid, but it was no longer sufficient. You had to vary everything: distance, direction, timing, even the number of rounds before displacement. Brennan had listened to the briefing and understood that the war had entered a new phase of tactical evolution. Both sides were learning, adapting, developing countermeasures to countermeasures. What had started as a simple survival technique, move after 50 rounds, had become a complex game of prediction and variation. You couldn't just follow doctrine anymore. You had to think like your enemy, anticipate what he was anticipating, stay one step ahead in a race that had no finish line except death or victory. Now, watching the trail through the Borneo jungle, Brennan saw the Japanese column approaching exactly as intelligence had predicted. Maybe 30 soldiers, moving supplies toward a defensive position that would be attacked tomorrow by Australian infantry. Brennan's job was to interdict the supply movement, kill or scatter the Japanese troops, delay their reinforcement of the defensive line. Simple mission, probably his 238th of the war, though he'd stopped counting somewhere in New Guinea when the numbers became meaningless. He opened fire at 70 yards, the Vickers hammering out its familiar rhythm. The Japanese scattered, some dropping immediately, others diving for cover in the thick undergrowth. Return fire came quickly, rifles and at least one light machine gun, bullets cracking through the canopy above Brennan's position. Pierce counted rounds, his voice steady and automatic. 20, 25, 30. They had agreed beforehand to displace at 43 rounds this time, varying from their usual 50, to deny the Japanese observers any reliable pattern. At 43 rounds, they moved, grabbing the gun and scrambling to the first alternate position 22 meters northwest of their original location. The displacement took 11 seconds, longer than Brennan liked, but the jungle undergrowth was thick and the gun caught on vines. They set up, and Brennan opened fire again on the Japanese troops trying to organize a counterattack. 37 rounds from this position before they displaced again, this time 19 meters almost due south, back toward their original position, but offset to create an unpredictable pattern. The Japanese mortar fire started during their third displacement. The first round landed near their original position, exactly as expected. But the second round didn't land where Brennan would have anticipated based on standard ranging procedure. It landed near their first alternate position, the one they'd already abandoned. The third round landed between the first and second positions, as if the Japanese mortar crew was trying to cover the probable displacement route rather than targeting specific positions. Brennan and Pierce set up in the fourth position and opened fire again, but both men understood they were dealing with an enemy who'd learned the same lessons they had. They displaced 6 more times over the next 20 minutes, never firing more than 50 rounds from any position, never moving in predictable directions or distances. The Japanese mortar fire followed them across the jungle, sometimes landing close enough that shrapnel sang through the trees, sometimes missing by 50 meters, as if the enemy observer was guessing rather than calculating. The engagement ended when the surviving Japanese troops withdrew, leaving bodies scattered along the trail and supply packs that would never reach their intended destination. Brennan and Pierce sat in their 7th position, breathing hard, the Vickers steaming in the humid jungle air. They'd fired approximately 240 rounds total, spread across 7 different positions, following no pattern that Brennan could discern, even though he'd planned the sequence himself. The Japanese had tried to predict their movements, had tried to pre-range mortar fire on anticipated positions, and had failed, because Brennan and Pierce had been doing this long enough to randomize even their own tactical decisions. But sitting there in the jungle, Brennan understood something that made him profoundly tired. The war would end soon, everyone said so, but the techniques they'd developed would persist. Some Japanese observer had documented their displacement patterns, had tried to find exploitable regularities in Australian machine gun doctrine. That information would be studied, refined, passed on to the next war and the next generation of soldiers who would face the same problem. How to employ firepower without becoming a target, how to kill without being killed, how to turn survival into science. Pierce was cleaning the gun, his movements as automatic as breathing. Quote, 3-6, he asked quietly. Brennan didn't have to calculate. 237 times in 3 years, give or take, maybe more, lost count somewhere. Pierce nodded, didn't look up from his work. Quote, 38. It was meant as a joke, but it landed wrong, hit too close to something neither man wanted to examine. Brennan thought about going home, about sitting in one place without counting rounds, without calculating displacement routes, without listening for the sound of incoming mortar fire. He couldn't imagine it. The habit had been burned into him too deeply, written into muscle memory and instinct. A runner appeared from the battalion command post, a kid who looked maybe 18, too young for the war, but here anyway. He had orders for Brennan: hold position overnight, interdict any further Japanese movement on the trail, prepare for relief tomorrow when the main attack went in. Standard stuff. The runner left, and Brennan looked at the 9 prepared positions scattered across 100 meters of jungle, looked at Pierce, who was already arranging ammunition belts in the specific order they'd used for 3 years. They'd do it all again tonight, and tomorrow night if necessary, moving the gun every 40 or 50 or 60 rounds, varying the pattern, staying alive through mathematics and discipline, and the accumulated wisdom of 237 previous displacements. And somewhere in the jungle, Japanese observers would watch and count and try to solve the problem of targets that refused to stay still long enough to die. The war ended on the 15th of August, 1945, though news took 3 days to reach Brennan's position in the Borneo interior. When it came, delivered by the same young runner who'd brought previous orders, the information felt abstract and disconnected from the reality of sitting behind a Vickers in prepared defensive positions. The Japanese forces in their sector hadn't received word yet, or had received it and chosen to ignore it, so the Australians maintained their positions and waited for formal surrender protocols to filter down through chains of command that moved at bureaucratic speeds, regardless of whether the shooting had stopped. Brennan and Pierce spent those strange in-between days maintaining their gun, preparing positions they probably wouldn't use, counting rounds they probably wouldn't fire. The habit was too ingrained to abandon just because someone in Tokyo or Washington had signed papers. On the third day after the announcement, a Japanese officer appeared on the trail under a white flag, accompanied by 2 enlisted men who looked as exhausted and bewildered as Brennan felt. The formal surrender of their sector happened without ceremony, without drama, just men acknowledging that the mathematical contest of observation and displacement had finally been resolved by forces larger than artillery tables and muzzle flash calculations. Brennan was rotated back to Australia in October, processed through a demobilization camp where doctors examined him for physical wounds and completely missed the ones that mattered. He was given a suit that didn't fit, a railway ticket to Sydney, and a small payment that was supposed to represent 3 years of his life spent moving machine guns across hostile ground. The suit he gave to someone who needed it more. The money he spent on a bottle of whiskey that he drank alone in a hotel room while trying to remember what silence sounded like when it wasn't tactical. Civilian life was supposed to be a return to normalcy, but Brennan discovered that normalcy was a concept that applied to other people. He found work at a factory, lost it when he dove under a table because a truck backfired. Found another job at a warehouse, lost that one when he snapped at a supervisor who wanted him to stay in one position for an entire shift without moving. The problem wasn't that he couldn't hold a job. The problem was that some part of his brain was still counting, still calculating displacement routes, still waiting for the ranging shots that would walk toward wherever he stood still too long. He tried explaining it once to a woman he met at a dance, a nice girl who worked at a department store and had kind eyes that reminded him of someone he couldn't quite place. They were sitting in a cafe and she asked him about the war, the question people always asked when they saw the look in your eyes that marked you as someone who'd been somewhere they hadn't. Brennan told her about the 50-round rule, about moving machine guns, about the mathematics of survival. She'd listened politely and then asked if he'd killed anyone. He'd gotten up and left without answering. Because the question missed the point entirely. Years passed in the way years do when you're not paying close attention. Brennan got married, had children, found stable work as a construction supervisor where movement was expected and staying still was actually discouraged. He didn't talk about the war, didn't attend reunions, didn't keep in touch with anyone from his unit. Pierce had gone back to Brisbane, last Brennan heard, was working at a garage and doing fine. Some men process their war by talking about it. Brennan processed his by never mentioning it, by building a life where the habit of constant displacement could masquerade as normal restlessness. His grandson found him one afternoon in 1972, sitting on the back porch of the house Brennan had built with his own hands. The boy was maybe 12, curious about everything, asked questions that adults had learned not to ask. He'd been studying World War II at school, had come across something in a library book about Australian machine gun tactics. Did Granddad know about the 50-round rule? Was it true they moved their weapons constantly? Brennan looked at his grandson and saw innocent curiosity, unmarked by any understanding of what counting to 50 actually meant when people were trying to kill you. He set down his tea, the cup rattling slightly against the saucer in hands that had developed a tremor over the years. Then he told his grandson about muzzle flash and artillery observers, about Macklin and the dark sand at their first position in Libya, about Collins who'd held one position too long at Bardia. He told him about El Alamein and the decision to fire 200 rounds from one spot, about the shell that should have killed him but didn't, because luck sometimes matters more than mathematics. He told him about Borneo and the final displacement, number 237, moving a gun he'd probably never have to fire again. The boy listened with the attention children give to stories that sound like adventure but haven't yet been processed into understanding. When Brennan finished, his grandson asked if it had been scary, moving all the time, never staying still. Brennan thought about that question, about how to explain fear to someone who'd never had to calculate the ballistic arc of incoming artillery. Quote 39, he said finally. Quote 40. His grandson went inside eventually, probably to play or watch television or do whatever children did when war stories stopped being interesting. Brennan sat on his porch and listened to the ordinary sounds of suburban Sydney. Cars passing, neighbors talking, someone's radio playing music from a world that had moved on from machine guns and displacement tactics. But some part of him was still counting, still listening for the sound of ranging shots, still ready to move after 48 rounds because 50 was cutting it close, and Collins had learned that lesson too late. The habit never left, not really. Even now, decades after the war, Brennan found himself uncomfortable in restaurants if he sat in one spot too long, found himself shifting position in movie theaters, found himself calculating alternate routes whenever he walked anywhere. The mathematics of survival had been written too deeply into his nervous system to erase with peace treaties and demobilization papers. He'd learned to live with it, the way you learn to live with any permanent injury. And sometimes, when he heard someone count past 48 for any reason, he'd flinch slightly, and his hands would move in a gesture that looked like nothing, but was actually the first motion of grabbing a machine gun tripod and preparing to displace to ground that might keep you alive for another 50 rounds. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment about which historical topic you'd like to see explored next. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories of tactical innovation and human adaptation to light.